Bryan Kohberger is going to be incarcerated in one of America's worst prisons, with number 2 speared around. So, pretty gross stuff. It's a maximum security. It's been described as a hellhole. And it has accusations of brutal guards, rioting inmates, and a biohazard ventilation system. So this is the outside of it, but I'm going to show you a lot more interior photos that I went and found that's separate from this article. Confinement for 23 hours a day. And I think Bryan Kohberger is also going to be in protective custody. So he will also be locked away for 23 hours a day. This means little to no interaction. Food is going to be eaten in a cell. He'll be showering 3 times a week. And this is a pattern that some inmates live under for decades. 97% of these guys are going to get out and walk into the Idaho community. And so this guy is advocating for better prison conditions. He's expected to be transferred to the maximum security institution just 10 miles south of where his sentencing hearing will be on July 23rd. And I will be live streaming that. So it's surrounded by a double perimeter fence, razor wire, and an electronic detection system, and 24-hour armed patrol. And the prison conditions were so bad that inmates went on a hunger strike, begging for better conditions. So let me know what you think about that. And one of their most famous residents of this prison is Chad Daybell, who was sentenced to capital punishment. This is where Bryan Kohberger is going to spend the rest of his life. This is let me move myself down here. This is the barbed wire, and this is an electric fence. So if you touch it, you will get zapped. And let's look at some of the interior photos. So this is what it looks like. It's got downstairs and then upstairs, and it literally is a cage upstairs. I guess that's so nobody's jumping off the rails. And you can see the size, and you can get a sense of how small these cells are just by how close they are together. So this is his cell right here. It's pretty small. And you can see from 49 to 50, you can see it's probably about long enough for somebody to lie down. That's the width of it. And that's not including the wall. So it's going to be very, very tiny, very, very tight quarters. I don't know if he'll be upstairs or downstairs, but he's going to be locked in this little room for 23 hours a day. Now, there may come a time later when he's not in protective custody that they may enter him in gen population, but he won't start there. He will begin on 23-hour lockdown. And you can just get a sense. So this is what this overlooks. And you can see these little cages. This is when somebody's not behaving well or behaving correctly. They will be put into this little cage where they can't even lie down. They have to sit up. And so he may, for his own protection, have to eat his meals either in his cell or in this little cage. And you can see there are 2 of them, while the rest of the inmates are allowed to come out and socialize. So that's a really small little cage. You can't even lie down in there. But if he is allowed out to eat his meals, I think initially he will be in one of these little cages. You can clearly see how small these cells are. You can see 44 and 45. So barely enough room for somebody to lie down in the cell. And you can just see, the locks and the chains on it. There's not bars. So I don't think it's going to be that easy for him to talk to other people. There's not an open window. Everything is closed. So I think he is going to be very, very isolated. You can see how thick the door is. And you can see here, if you look at the door that's open over this way, you can see that little window and how tiny it is and how difficult it would be for him to communicate, even with the person next door, with that little window. And then you can see the slot below that where they'll be passing his food to him through that slot. And I think initially he will be eating his meals in this cell. And then later he might be allowed out into the cage I just showed you, and he'll be able to eat his meals in the cage, in one of these little cages. And then eventually, maybe after a couple of years, he will be allowed into general population. So the cells are really close to each other and the windows are really small. And so he could maybe open up the little flap that you can see right here and where they pass the food through, he might be able to pop that open and try to talk to somebody next to him, but he's not going to have much social interaction at all. And this is another shot of the facility. You can see there's a prison guard here in the middle and another station for another guard here. And you can see the tables and chairs, and you can see how it's noisy it's going to be for Bryan Kohberger. There's no carpeting, there's nothing to absorb the sound with the exception of maybe some ceiling tiles. So it's going to echo and it's going to be really loud in the prison, even with his door closed and a window. He's still going to get the sound through the little slot that they pass the meals through. So I think it's going to be very loud, very noisy, very uncomfortable, very different from where he is now in jail, where he's got a TV and he's got his vegan meals and he's let out regularly. So very, very different. And then this is a close-up of the cage that I was talking to you about. This is when somebody comes out of isolation. They're placed here to see how they do, but they can also be placed here to eat meals, to just be let out and eat the meals. They have a little bit of a bigger window, but they're still locked up and they can't even lie down in there. I want to talk about Dr. Ramsland and this book deal. So let's talk about the fact that there is going to be restitution in this case. This makes me feel a little bit better. I have to tell you that at the top of the hearing, I was feeling upset about the idea that Dr. Ramsland was planning to write this book with Bryan Kohberger. I don't know if Bryan Kohberger's agreed to this or not, but she's already been talking about it, and she's still under a gag order. But she's I think she stopped granting interviews, but she was, when she heard about the plea deal, she did make sure everybody knew that she was planning to write this book with she wanted to write this book with Bryan Kohberger. And we know she spent 5 years, according to her, writing a book with Dennis Rader, who was the BTK killer. And some of the feelings that I have about this is that I'm really upset. I feel like this is ridiculous that he gets to have her attention on him, because that's going to give him narcissistic supply, and that he, gets to write a book deal out of this. I mean, I think that I wish that had been factored in to the plea deal, but at least he cannot appeal and put the families through endless appeals. But it really, really does bother me, and it was bothering me a lot of the thought that he could make money from this. But the judge did lift my spirits on this a little bit. He talked about the fact that there would be fines against Bryan Kohberger and restitution, and that he was going to or could impose these on Bryan Kohberger, which means that any proceeds that Bryan Kohberger would receive from his book would likely go back to families of the victims. Now, maybe he can try to skirt around this by putting it to his parents. I don't know how that is going to work, but if his parents agree, he could say, just give it all to my parents, and his parents could just be then putting it into his commissary. But I do think it's really something that we need to address as a society, is that, is it okay for these guys to come out and write book deals while we have victims, family members who were stuck under this gag order, this ridiculously reaching gag order that for 2 years kept the victims' families from being able to speak out, that for 2.5 years, almost 3 years, kept Dylan and Bethany, it'll be 3 years in November, kept Dylan and Bethany from being able to speak out, to even defend themselves. So, I know that Dr. Ramsland is probably a really good professor. She seems like a very nice person. I know she's, wants to write a book. She says it's to study him. But, if studying BTK was supposed to help identify other people who would act like this, well, this guy was in multiple classes with Dr. Ramsland. So I guess my question is, if she was, learned a bunch from doing this 5-year book deal with BTK, Dennis Rader, wouldn't she have learned something that would have helped her spot Bryan Kohberger? Or was it because the classes were online due to the pandemic that she didn't get a chance to interact with him personally? And again, I'm not impugning her integrity. Obviously, she just is very interested in this topic. This is what she teaches. This is what she's devoted her life to. But I do think that he's going to, and I'm talking about Bryan Kohberger here, feel very important to have his professor coming to interview him and study him. I think he's going to love that. Um, and remember, he stood up at that hearing when uh, he was at the hearing with Judge John Judge, and he stood silent because I think at some level, Bryan Kohberger did not want to say he wasn't guilty. Bryan Kohberger wanted to have it both ways, in my opinion, not face capital punishment, and he wanted to take credit for these crimes. And I think somebody like Bryan Kohberger, who studied criminal justice, would have understood how attorneys in courtrooms work. So I think he intended to stand silent. I think on some level, Bryan Kohberger did not want to say that he was not guilty. I think he wanted people to know he did it. If you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button. It's free and it helps me out a lot. Give this a thumbs up and drop me a comment. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comment section below. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.